Good morning and warm welcome to everyone attending remotely and in the room to the 20th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee. Can I remind everyone to turn their mobile phones and other devices to silent for the duration of the meeting. First item of business today is apologies from Ian Gray, MSP, and can I welcome to committee Neil Finlay, MSP, and can I ask Mr Finlay to declare any interests?
I'm a former school teacher and member of the EIS.
Thank you, Mr Finlay. Can I remind all members and witnesses and staff present that social distancing measures are in place in committee rooms and across the Holyrood campus. I ask that all take care to observe these measures over the course of the morning's meeting, including when entering and exiting the committee rooms. Our next item is a decision to take what was item 3 in private, which will be a discussion on the evidence today. Are members content to do so? Thank you. Our next agenda item is a return to our investigation into counsellors in school education. And we have this morning taking evidence from ADIS, COSLA and ASPEC. And can I warmly welcome remotely to committee Barry Syme, Treasurer and Executive Committee Member of the Association of Scottish Principal Education Psychologists, ASPEP, Laura Cavan, Policy Manager for Children and Young People at COSLA, and Jennifer King, ADIS Network Chair for Children and Young People, ASN Services, from the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland, ADIS. All of our witnesses are attending remotely, so can I ask both members and witnesses to leave a short gap between contributions to ensure broadcasting can activate appropriate microphones. Can I also remind members to direct their questions to particular witnesses where appropriate. If not, I shall put it to the whole panel. Witnesses are welcome to state if they have nothing they wish to contribute or if they wish to come in, if they could indicate to the clerks remotely, that would be very helpful. And can I invite Laura Cavan to make an opening statement on behalf of the panel?
Thanks, Convener, and for inviting us to speak to you today on behalf of local government. Thanks as well for maintaining a focus on mental health and wellbeing at this time. The committee will be aware that central to the recovery curriculum is health and wellbeing. It's one of the 3 key components alongside literacy and numeracy, and as we are all aware, learning is compromised if health and wellbeing are compromised. Pre-COVID and after the publication of their 2018-19 programme for government, Scottish Government was working with COSLA and partners on a range of measures aimed at enhancing mental health and wellbeing. These are rooted in GIRFIC and include increased and improved training resources and offers for school staff, along with access to counsellors via schools for children and young people over the age of 10. A set of principles for delivery were developed and agreed politically, and one of the most important of these was that counselling be provided as part of a range of approaches to support children and young people in line with GIRFIC. Work began on this last year, with full rollout intended for September this year. COVID will undoubtedly have had an impact on delivery timescales. However, it's important to note how local authorities and partners and the wider communities have worked together to support children and young people throughout the period of school closures. We saw innovative approaches with technology being used to provide support and contact, and we saw a range of online and printed resources being developed and shared. We also saw young people themselves doing a lot to support each other. They were using technology better than any of us could. There's a lot of learning we can do over these past few months. We also know, however, that many children, young people, and indeed adults really struggled. There is therefore a lot of work to be done to help people rebuild and recover not only their learning, but their confidence, their trust, and their relationships. Once again, thanks to the committee for keeping this important issue of wellbeing at the forefront of all of our minds.
Thank you very much. Just before we move to questions from members, could I open with a question? Obviously, this policy was in place before COVID, before we even had heard of the possibility of COVID, and the requirement was identified within our schools. Is it still fit for for purpose following COVID, knowing that mental health and wellbeing there's been a dramatic effect on that for our young people during the COVID outbreak and going forward? I'll go to Mr. Syme first, if he wants to come in.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I believe it still is fit for purpose. We've had counselling in schools for many years in various authorities, and I think it's really welcome that we now have the offer across Scotland. We have learned a lot from COVID, and I think that will be discussed this morning in terms of how we deliver it remotely. And I think it's something we have to be thinking about in terms of future contracts, about how we build resilience into the system so you can actually have other ways of working. I think some of the providers of existing services on counselling have done incredibly well, but we have to think ahead about how we would use this. And I think COVID will be around for quite a while, so we need to be thinking in different ways of how we do remote counselling. But a lot of the evidence coming through from some of the providers is that young people want face-to-face counselling, and they'd rather wait to have face-to-face counselling rather than try and do it remotely. And I think there are other issues that we could explore.
Thank you. Does Ms Cavan want to come in?
I don't think that I have anything to add to that, no.
Okay. Ms King? Do you wish?
I think I would certainly support what Barry has said, Convener. I think that we need to have that adaptability as we go through the further procurement and implementation of our services. Yes, there's things to be learned from COVID, but your question was, is the intent of the policy still relevant? And yes, absolutely it is.
Can we now move to questions from the committee? Can I first go to Ms Wishart, to be followed by Daniel Johnson?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. You've already touched on, Barry, about remote delivery and resilience in going forward. There's an issue around young people who have not been able to access technology or digital platforms. How would you propose getting around that?
Mr Syme?
I think that there's thank you. There are several ways we need to think about this. Even when young people were involved in counselling, and in my experience, some of the providers had contact, when they were trying to get through to the young person, it was via the parents, and some young people were having real difficulty in that the parents were not necessarily allowed to contact the counsellors, and also the time. The young person may well have been in bed, sleeping, whatever. So that was an issue that we have to be thinking about, how we actually maintain contact with young people at a personal level. But I also think we have to look at community resources, things like libraries, other community venues where a young person can access information technology. Some local authorities with the rollout of ICT in terms of iPads is another opportunity. But it's something we really need to be thinking about, is how we give them the maximum opportunity to access technology.
Thank you for that. Can I ask the same question of Jennifer, please?
Yeah, Ms King?
Yes, I would just add to what Barry said. I think it's also about an element of choice for young people in terms of what how they want to relate to and experience counselling. And while we've got to have some flexibility if we have to scale up or scale down, depending on what happens with COVID, I think that young people, certainly from our local experience, while yes, there was a desire to get back to face-to-face counselling, a number of them, particularly I think if the relationship with the counsellor has been established in the first place, preferably face-to-face, moving then to having to have counselling by phone, for example, or which would be an alternative to other forms of virtual or digital counselling would be preferable. So I think there's something about if the counselling relationship has been established first, that may give a greater strength, if you like, to a young person's element of choice and being able to continue a counselling relationship by some means other than face-to-face.
Okay.
And does Laura have any comment on that point?
Yeah, Ms Cavan?
I would add that there is a wider commitment around digital access for children and young people that I think the committee probably had details of a couple of meetings ago around access to Chromebooks and access to technology and other means. We do know that there are issues with, for example, broadband access, and that's something that's been considered in the wider context, not just in terms of counselling or access to support. The other element that I might add is that we've had feedback that some children and young people are actually finding that using messaging rather than actually speaking is preferable, and being able to message a counsellor or being able to message whoever they're supporting, accessing support from or speaking to is a more convenient method of technology, especially if they're in their own house and don't want to be overheard. So there's, like I said at the start, a range of learning that we can take, but it's certainly on our radar that we need to improve the digital access for everyone in Scotland.
Ms. Wishart?
That's helpful. Thank you, convener. I do have another question. Do you want me to ask it now or?
No, please
right,
go
okay.
ahead.
Thank you. If the additional counsellors that are needed are people that are already trained, do we know who exactly they are and what they're doing at the moment? I'm thinking in terms of if the shift to the role is towards counselling for children, will it have a negative impact on other mental health services? For example, for adults, for psychological therapies, we know there's a waiting list for adults. So I'm wondering who's already in the system and how that might impact on other services.
Okay,
So I wonder if Barry could
go to Mr. Syme first, please.
I'm not sure I can really answer that because I don't have the actual data. The focus that I've been working on within certainly Glasgow is with larger providers. So that's been my main focus. So I really can't say on the ground where the workforce will be coming from. Would it be a transfer from, I know anecdotally there are adult counsellors who are retraining via the universities and other providers to move into that sector, but I think it's more of the complexity, and maybe that will be explored this morning, around whether or not you're using a commissioned service or a more localised service. So it's quite complicated, if that answers the question.
Thank you.
it's understandable.
Ms. Cavan?
Yeah, I suppose I would add that alongside the work around counsellors, I know that Scottish Government colleagues were working with SQA and other bodies to look at how they could develop qualifications for counsellors who perhaps, like Barry said, wanted to train to support children and young people who were currently working with adults. That doesn't answer your question, but it is something that is on their radar. And I know as well that you're speaking to the Deputy First Minister next week, so he might have more details on that. I know that there were conversations in developing this commitment with the registering bodies, COSCA and BACP, around the routes that people could qualify to become counsellors and the numbers of counsellors available. So that might be something that you wish to explore there.
Ms. King?
I think I would only add that I think it's a question, obviously, that does need further consideration in terms of a whole system approach to mental health and wellbeing more widely, and it may be something that's also worth considering within the framework for community mental health and wellbeing supports and services. So I think it's too early to say, and we don't have the data, as Barry said, but something to keep an eye to and in consultation with the organisations Laura's referred to.
Thank you.
Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Ms. Wishart. Can we move to Mr. Johnson to be followed by Dr. Allen?
Convener, can I begin just by reminding the committee of my own diagnosis and the fact that I'm a trustee of the ADHD Foundation. So my questions are principally around service design and how this will integrate with the rest of the activities within schools. And as no doubt our panellists are aware, the Morgan Review was published in June this year. And stated specifically with reference to widening access that there's a good deal of scepticism and disappointment in the way that GERFIC is operating, and specifically referencing those processes. So I think my question is informed by this, and I think clearly wanting to make sure that this works. What is happening to make sure that the new school counsellors integrate with the rest of the school's approaches and practices, so that this is actually part of a whole school approach, which I think is very much the tenor of the Morgan Review in terms of the points it's making in terms of how we can improve provision for ASN. And I think I'd probably put that to Ms King in the first instance, but I'm very happy to hear from other panellists.
Okay, Ms King.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think that from the early stages of implementation, and I'm speaking also from a Tayside perspective, where we're currently underway in looking at the service design with providers. It's first of all a key area and a requirement that we ask providers to be able to demonstrate that they will give evidence to us of how they are integrating within the school's system, and that would include obviously the staged intervention process in terms of getting it right for every child. So I suppose that's a starting point, and for the services that have been in early stages of implementation or piloting in our area, the feedback from the schools that I work with has been that counselling services and their leads have worked very closely with the leads in schools to ensure that the counselling service is not one that is standalone, but that is based within looking at the overall assessment of a young person's well-being, and in making well-informed judgments about which young people are going to benefit from counselling, because we know that for some young people, counselling is not the right intervention. So I think, again, we're in relatively early stages, but I think for the authorities and schools that already have counselling underway, we're confident that that's working within a staged intervention framework. And I think the role that the counselling coordinators will have in each local authority will give us a means by which we have some moderation and quality assurance around that.
Okay.
Thank you. Does Mr Syme want to come in on that as well? Or?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I would agree entirely with what Ger has just said. It has to fit within the staged intervention framework. And I think that the local authority that I work in, we've taken a tiered approach, as many others have done, where you have a wide range of offers around mental health, and counselling is certainly one of the significant offers. But it has to fit within that framework, because my personal view as a psychologist is that counselling works very well for some young people, but you have to be in a place where you're ready to take counselling, and you also have to have the emotional skills and literacy to be able to talk through your problem. So just shoehorning somebody into a service is not going to necessarily benefit them in any way. I think you have to have a broad offer. I think as young people mature, certainly goes into secondary school, they become more willing to look at person-centred counselling. However, with younger children, I think they may struggle, so we have to have a much broader offer. So that's why you tend to have a kind of mental health framework within local authorities, and counselling fits very well within that. But it has to be identified at a specific tier, probably a tier 2 intervention, and it'll be very, very clear when you actually have to then move on if counselling isn't working. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Cavan, I can actually see you on the screen. Do you want to come in if you raise your hand? If you do, if not, we'll go back to Mr Johnson. Right, thank you, Mr Johnson.
So I was just really very interested in following up on the points that Mr Syme just made there. So, I mean, I think he's absolutely correct that there's a limit to what counselling can provide, and that there are also questions about the appropriateness of it for certain individuals. So can I ask, what work has been done to look at how it integrates with services outside the school? I mean, in particular, are there direct referral pathways to CAMHS, and how is that working? Because clearly that's going to be really a vitally important step.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mr. Syme first again for that.
Thank you for that. I think if we go back to the principles of GIRFEC and putting the child at the centre, then we should be asking the question, what are the barriers to the young person's well-being? We then have to think about a system around the child. So a lot of local authorities, education services would have either multi-agency support teams, joint support teams, joint assessment teams. And I think there has to be ownership of the young person's problem at that level, and a decision made about where you're at, where's best placed. So if a referral is going to CAMHS, then it should be facilitated through that. And if there is a delay about accessing CAMHS, then support should still be put in place. So it may well be that counselling would be offered or some other form of therapy as an interim intervention. If that was the case, I think some of my concerns, and I gave when I was involved with the evaluation about CAM services, is that the majority of referrals, probably 70%, come via general practitioners. So that's families who have got issues having to go to their GP, and the GP necessarily have to make a referral to CAMHS. But at the end of the day, the child is still in school. There still should be a support mechanism around that. So I think we are getting much better at that, but I still think there's a piece of work to do, and I think probably counselling services will fit in with that multi-agency joint support team, joint assessment team.
Okay. I'm looking to see if anyone else, if Ms King wants to come in, or Ms Cavan on that area. I have a couple of... Daniel, do you want to come back in?
Could I just ask one final...
Yes, of course.
So I've got one final question in this theme, and it relates to my declaration at the beginning. So obviously I take a keen interest in neurodevelopmental disorders. And I think one of the questions I quite regularly have when we're talking about this space is what do we mean by mental health? I think sometimes I'm concerned that we are just talking about anxiety and depression, though those are clearly very important, but they're all, in my view, very often symptoms of other underlying issues, conditions and situations. So just wondering kind of what is the scope of the counselling service? What is being done to make sure that it encompasses things like ADHD, autistic spectrum disorder or other neurodevelopmental disorders, and integrate with relevant and appropriate services?
Okay, I'm going to go to Ms King first for that one.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think we've got something to learn probably from the recent framework that the Welsh Government and BACP have developed, which does give recognition to the taking into account, if you like, the neurodevelopmental needs that some young people will have. I think it still comes back to, though, I mean, one of the critical things that we expect of any counsellor in a counselling service is their clinical judgment and their capacity to formulate. So what is the analysis of this young person's need, irrespective of what their diagnostic label might be? That is something certainly that we would be expecting and would be looking for in any provider's model of delivery. So I think that, yes, we do need to take account of that, but I don't think it's just the diagnostic label, if you like, but I think it's how that young person presents and what barriers they may have. But we've got some, I think, as we progress further, but at a national level around this, taking some learning from the Welsh model would be helpful to us in that.
Ms Cavan, Mr Syme, do you want to come in on this issue? I'm not seeing an indication. I've had a couple of members indicate they want supplementary questions. Can I go to Ms Mackay first?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I wanted to ask Jennifer King, please, in your earlier answer to Daniel Johnson, you talked about I think it was the Tayside framework you referred to that you've been involved in. I appreciate you probably don't have exact data as you said earlier, but can you clarify whether you know what the consistency of service is like throughout Scotland?
Ms King?
Thank you for your question. I couldn't give you, an exact picture of that at the moment. I refer to Tayside because I work within Dundee City Council, and we're taking a Tayside approach to this with the three authorities, with a rationale for that. I suppose early indication in terms of what we know from some of those providers, obviously, and the conversations that ASPEP and ADES have had, is that there are a range of obviously big providers, if you like, big organisations who already have are already working in a number of authorities across Scotland, and some authorities will have a blend of that, and perhaps they're in-house, if you like, or those who have been employed directly by the council. But I think those of us who have who are working on a larger scale, if you like, have had to obviously take into account procurement processes, and that is another factor, I suppose, in the how far we have progressed, taking account obviously of COVID. So no, I couldn't give you exact data around that at the moment. That's something that I think that we might need to refer back to our colleagues in government.
Can I ask Ms Cavan if COSLA has a picture of this across Scotland?
In terms of the provision of the specific commitment around counselling, or in terms of the wider mental health support available for children and young people, could I clarify?
I think Ms Mackay,
Yeah,
you want?
yeah, it really was the wider mental health counselling throughout Scotland, if you have any indication of that.
I think we know from earlier survey that government colleagues did that there are a range of different approaches being taken to support children and young people. They did a bit of work to ascertain what was going on to support children and young people during the period of school closures. And we know that there were that all local authorities and their partners were doing a great deal to ensure that there was support available, and taking different approaches, which might have involved technology, might have involved physically distant visits, and might have involved supporting families or supporting parents as well. So in terms of, I wouldn't have figures or anything like that, but we know that Scotland's a very diverse, has a very the local areas have very diverse needs, and therefore they need diverse solutions and diverse approaches. So there's support available, but it'll look different wherever you are.
Okay. Thank you. Mr Finlay.
10 years ago, I was a support for learning teacher, and making referrals to education psychologists was a very frustrating process, and usually resulted in extremely long waits for pupils to be assessed. I just wonder if that has changed any. But also this week, my local newspaper has highlighted the situation in NHS Lothian, where 60% of young people are waiting over 4.5 months for their first consultation on mental health. 19% are waiting over a year for their first consultation, having been referred. That's 472 children that are waiting that length of time. Now, anecdotally, and I'm looking around the room, I'm sure members will probably be experience the same as me, is that more and more families are approaching the likes of us and counsellors and others, more of them with children with mental health problems, and more acute mental health problems, certainly over the period that I've been in this place. That situation in Lothian is absolutely dreadful for families who are desperate for help. The situation to me seems to be getting significantly worse instead of better. I wonder if you can comment on the fact that we've got 20% waiting longer than a year for their first referral, and 60% waiting over 4.5 months when they should be getting treated within 18 weeks.
I'll put that to the panel, Mr Finlay. I'm not sure it it will actually be covered by what they were here to do about the councillors in schools, but I'm looking to see Mr Syme to come in.
The point I'm making, convener, is that if this is not joined up, then the schools may be referring, or social work may be referring, or some will be referring people for a mental health consultation via the NHS. And this is the situation that they're facing, which will have a massive impact when that child the following day goes to school, and the following week goes to school, and for the next year goes to school, having seen anyone.
I appreciate the point, but I'm not sure if the panel will want to have a view on that, but I'll go to Mr Syme first.
I mean, I take Mr Finley's point, and I'm afraid I really can't comment on referrals to CAMHS because it's out with my remit. Certainly the work that I'm strategically involved with in my local authority is looking at that early intervention, and I fully accept that once you reach a tier 3, tier 4 level, there are challenges, but I think overall we have to be working towards more capacity building within staff and allowing staff to support young people before the actual problems arise. And I accept that with COVID, that's been an incredible challenge, but some of the work that we've been doing, particularly around the West Regional Improvement Collaborative, where we've got 8 local authorities working together on mental health strategy and mental health policy, and it's trying to build that capacity within staff and looking at other supports and services, counselling one of them. The other thing is actually training up support for learning workers within awareness of mental health, suicide prevention, self-harm awareness. We're not trying to turn people into specialists, but I think having that confidence to ask a young person, how are you actually feeling? And are our schools nurturing enough that they feel, in terms of relationships, they can actually approach people and talk about their difficulties? So I know I haven't answered your question in relation to the waiting list. I would hope that over time, and I have to say, I've been really focusing on mental health for the past probably 6-7 years. And I think there's a real opportunity at the minute where we are. It's on the agenda and people are actually talking about it, and not in a way as an illness, but actually looking at how do we accept that everybody's got mental health and your mental health change on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Dr Allen and then Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, convener. I wonder if panel could say anything about the workforce planning that will have to go into this exercise of provision around the country and the training that will be involved. I just wonder if local authorities and others have collaborated with each other to try and give some shape, as I say, to what that workforce planning might look like across the country.
Okay, can I go to Miss Cavan first from COSLA and then the other members?
Thanks, convener. I referred earlier to the work that was going on around qualifications for people who wish to support children and young people in this way. So I'd probably refer to my earlier answer there around that. In terms of collaboration between local authorities, it might be better for Barry or Jennifer to comment on that.
Okay, Ms King, do you want to comment on collaboration across local authorities?
I can, yes, I can certainly say that from a Tayside perspective, the 3 local authorities have collaborated in our approach to counselling, first of all within the Tayside emotional health and wellbeing strategy. But as far as workforce planning is concerned, our intention and our aim of collaborating was to try, first of all, to ensure that we were not in direct competition with one another as 3 local authorities for counsellors and counselling services, and a collaborative procurement process has heavily supported that. We have had early discussions with one of the local universities in the area in relation to looking ahead to next year in terms of their output, if you like, or their the number of qualified counsellors who will be coming out of their programme. But that's probably as far as our collaboration with regard to the workforce planning of counsellors can take us at the moment. However, it is, I suppose, going back to that procurement process, it's something that we is a requirement that we ask all providers to evidence is how they will be able to meet the requirements and be able to provide continuity of service delivery over the term of the contract period, and how they will manage their own workforce planning. So I think it's back to a partnership. I think that while that responsibility lies with the provider, if you like, as a local authority, and in this case on a collaborative basis, we have a responsibility to work with them, quality assure that's happening. Further work probably be done in consultation with the universities, but we have started an early conversation with one of our local universities about that.
Would you like to, Mr. Syme, do you want to come in on that point from? No, I don't think he does. Dr. Allen. Maybe Mr. Syme does want to say. Mr. Syme.
Sorry, I'd like to say that there have been collaboration. I mean, certainly within ASPET, we came together and put a position paper on guidance around counselling some time ago, and that's been adopted by local authorities. But I think depending on the size of the local authority, you're very much restricted by procurement regulations. So in Glasgow, where I work, we were looking at the empowerment agenda and allowing schools to look at counselling. However, we couldn't do that because of the value of the contract. So we've now been working on that contract procurement for the past, when is it now? We're now in September. We started last November. We're now at a point where we will be going out to tender. But I think you have to look at the risks involved of employing individual counsellors against a commission service, and I think we would be wanting to look at, as certain other larger authorities are wanting to do, as a commission service where the risk around the employability and the quality assurance is taken on by that organisation. So there hasn't necessarily been any workforce planning. I think we rely on those larger third sector organisations to actually take that on board. So it's not something we've been looking at. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Allen.
As part of that planning exercise or forward-thinking exercise, I wonder if anyone, perhaps this is one for Ms King, can say anything about the rural weighting associated with the funding, or how that works. Obviously, there are going to be schools around the country where it's not going to be a whole person allocated, but some hours of a person. And also, if people had anything to say about some of the specific needs of schools around deprivation, and again, where that fitted into the thinking as you make plans for this new policy.
Okay. Ms Cavan.
Sorry. Yes, again, in our process.
Sorry, Ms King, I'd asked for Ms Cavan. Is that a question for Cosla? But I'm happy for you to come in, Ms King, and then we'll go to Ms Cavan. Thanks. Ms King, sorry.
Thank you. Again, I suppose I'm speaking from a Teesside perspective here, but recognise that obviously in terms of that diversity across the country, that where rurality was a factor, then that was something that we have asked providers to take into account. And similarly, where where there's deprivation. I think that the point is, though, that the guidance was clear that it was about schools and young people having access to counselling services, and not necessarily one counsellor per school, because we have to take into account the different demographics. So yes, both factors have been taken into account, and we ask obviously providers to demonstrate their knowledge of the local context in which they're going to be working in, which would take account of either or both of those factors.
Ms Cavan.
Thanks, convener. The kind of established process for any new monies and any additional commitments that local government are asked to deliver was followed. So the settlement and distribution group considered the distribution of funding, and there was a rural element added to that that distribution of funding. So that was certainly considered. One of the things that was important in that, though, was that further down the line, I can't recall exactly the time frame, that would be revisited to ensure that that was still the correct way or the correct weighting in terms of distribution of that funding.
Okay. Mr. Simon, I don't know if you want to come in on this, but if you could raise your hand. Yeah, that's fine. Dr. Alban? Oh, sorry, Mr. Simon does want to come in. Thanks. Mr. Simon.
Sorry, Convener. Thank you, Convener. It was just to say, I think if we go pre-counselling funding, if we actually look at how much money was being spent by local authorities using Pupil Equity Fund around mental health supports, and particularly in relation to local authorities with high levels of deprivation. So, you know, we were certainly finding in Glasgow that head teachers were using Pupil Equity Fund to support mental health. And if you look at in Glasgow, an example, like 58% of young people are SIMD 1 and 2. So there's a clear demand there in relation to mental health supports within the deprived communities. So it was just to kind of highlight that. Thank you.
Thank you. On a completely different or related theme, perhaps building on a point made by Mr. Johnson earlier on about the differing needs that young people have. Children First have submitted to us evidence around their views around that, and neither they nor I make this point to take away from the importance of mental health services, but they do say that they're particularly concerned by the way that some children and young people are presenting at universal services with requests for support around anxiety, depression and associated behaviours, with their distress being interpreted as mental illness in need of medication, when, as they go on to explain, and as others have pointed out, in many cases these are young people who have practical problems in their lives for which they're looking for solutions. And I just wonder how that's being factored into everyone's thinking. Perhaps as a question for Mr. Syme initially, how that is being factored into the planning that's going into providing for these counsellors to make sure that some of those options are looked at, not least liaison with families.
Okay, Mr. Syme.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. It's an excellent question, and it's something that we've been looking at. There has to be a linkage between family support strategy and the supports within health and social care partnerships, and also education services. So counselling has to link in with that, because I agree entirely with you that if the family are in crisis, then the young person will be in crisis. So we need to be thinking about how we actually support the family. And so some of the actual interventions that have been going on around local authorities, where it's not just focusing on the child, but more broadly, how do you support that family? And particularly as you come down into earlier years, because families are really struggling. So I think the two have to join up together. So a prime example is that the next 3-year mental health strategy within Glasgow is a joint one between the Health and Social Care Partnership and Education Services, so that we actually have joined up. And what you can then identify is where are the gaps. So you may well have counselling for a certain number of young people, but are there other supports required? So that's just an example of Glasgow. I don't know how it is elsewhere, but I certainly really agree with the Children's First submission.
Okay, Ms. King, do you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, I think I would agree with the comments that have been made so far, and I think the only thing I would add to it is that in that joining up, what we'd want to then be mindful of is that as we then look at further implementation of the community mental health and wellbeing supports and services framework, which has certainly a wider systems approach and very much takes into account the needs of families, that's another lens, if you like, that we have to look at this through, and seeing the young person very much part of their family or their community system. And there's an opportunity to do that, obviously, with that new framework and funding.
Thank you. I think that's Dr. Allen finished. Can we move to Jamie Halcrow-Johnson to be followed by Kenny Gibson?
Thank you very much. Convener, and panel. I just wanted to very quickly just comment on the comments that Beatrice Wisher made in relation to small communities where there are limited resources. Obviously this is an important policy, but we have to ensure that where there perhaps is a limit of qualified counsellors, that resources aren't just being kind of shifted around and taken from one part of the system to the other. I mean, it's interesting listening to the radio shinty team in Fort William had committed suicide over the last 20 years. There's a real issue around adult and particularly male mental health and suicide in the Highlands and Islands. So just to make that point, I think that in some of these areas it's vital that we ensure that resources aren't just being shifted around. Just in relation to the actual targets, the Scottish Government's targets, and this is, I think, a question for Laura Cavan and for Jennifer King, are you confident that those councillors will be in place across Scotland by the end of October, by that new deadline?
So I'm afraid I don't think the audio was working, being picked up and broadcast to a panel. Jamie, do you mind repeating? Is it okay?
From the top.
Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll move on. It's a different area, but we'll come back to you, Mr. Halcrow-Johnson, when the technology is fixed. Sorry about that, Mr. Gibson.
One of my better contributions as well.
Oh, it looks as if it's fixed now. We'll stay with Mr. Halcrow-Johnson. I'll come back to Mr. Gibson.
Okay, I'm sorry. This may feel like déjà vu for some people here in committee, but I think the point I was trying to make was Beatrice Wishart highlighted the issue around small communities where perhaps resource in terms of mental health counselling is limited, and that we have to be careful that that resource isn't just being moved from one part of the system to the next. And I was mentioning the case in Fort William where 6 members of one shinty team had committed suicide over the last 20 years, and there's a real issue around mental health in the Highlands, particularly amongst young men. The question I had, and as I think it was really probably for Laura Cavan and for Jennifer King, was that the Scottish Government target for delivery or for councillors to be in place has now been moved to the end of October, just by a month. Are you confident that that new target will be met?
Okay, can we go to Ms. Cavan first?
Certainly, thanks, Convener. In terms of October, what I would say is that there were a number of local authorities, a number of schools who already had full counselling and access to counsellors in place prior to the commitment being made, and over a number of years relating to PEF and relating to wider commitments around mental health. And Scottish Government officials did a survey to establish, before they made the commitment around that October date, to find out whether that would be doable, and they have fed back that they are confident that there will certainly be access to counsellors through schools in October. It may not be that the full commitment or the full delivery as it will look in its final state is in place by October, but there will certainly be access. And the other thing to remember is that this is one part of a wider system of supports that were either already in place or are being developed. For example, as I referred to earlier, the wider training resources for people supporting children and young people. Public Health Scotland, NHS Education for Scotland have been doing a great deal of work to ensure that there is information available so that anyone working with children and young people are able to up their level of knowledge and confidence around supporting children and young people. So this is one part of a wide range of supports that is or are available for children and young people. But in terms of the October question, I think that we're confident that there will be access, even if it isn't in the state that it may look when it's all in place completely. Procurement timelines and things like that have inevitably been delayed by the pandemic in some cases, but there's certainly the commitment and the will to continue moving this forward. Everyone is aware of how much of a pressing issue it was before COVID, and how much it will have become even more of a pressing issue now and going forward. Thanks.
Come in quickly before perhaps Jennifer King does, because the question will also be to her as well. So maybe not the full rollout, but access in place. Where are the difficult areas to do the full rollout, and what are the barriers? Is that perhaps some certain councils that are having difficulties accessing the personnel to do this, or is it a lack of resource, or what are the reasons for the lack of full rollout in certain areas, and where are those areas that you're aware of?
I couldn't give you names of local authorities. I wouldn't know that. That isn't our role as COSLA to, you know, we are a membership organisation who represents our members. We aren't, the members don't report to us in that way. In terms of barriers, I suppose delays in procurement, delays in training, delays in recruitment and things like that in relation to what has been going on over the past few months. But that might be something that you wish to explore with Scottish Government colleagues.
Okay, Ms King?
Yeah, I think I would probably just, thanks, I would just add to the to what Laura said, that I think that what's important is that while we're you know, looking towards that deadline and the importance of having access to counselling, the scale and the pace of it obviously are have to be balanced with ensuring that we make well-informed decisions for those of us who are working within procurement frameworks, that the counselling providers that are coming forward, that it's a model that we're confident can be delivered on. So I think that we also have to get it right, and I think that's as important as any you know, sticking to any deadlines to scale up quickly in order to simply have a service there. So we've got a duty, obviously, to be you know, mindful in terms of the you know, the value of the awards that are being made, and that therefore in going through, and I'm mindful that not all local authorities will necessarily be going through a procurement process, as some of us are, but it certainly it's a very robust process. It's one where when you are able to collaborate and have moderation, it gives you a very good insight into what we need in order to have a service that's also sustainable. And I think that's as important as what we're looking for in terms of the immediate implementation. We have to look beyond the immediate period of implementation and look at, have we got something that's going to be sustainable and resilient, you know, over the next, certainly over the period of the funding. And again, I think there's lessons for us in terms of the length of time that the counselling has been implemented in Wales over a 10-year period, where there's obviously been successive lessons learned from that, and they have been able to sustain counselling for a number of years now. And we should be looking long term at this. I understand that you know, we have you know, October is there in our minds, but this has to be something that lasts much longer than the next few months.
Thanks very much. If I can just come back to Ms King on that. Obviously, this has been in planning. It was meant to be delivered by the end of this month, but understandably, it's been pushed back. Are you confident that all councils are now aware of what model they're looking to roll out in their council areas? Because the suggestion I got from that was that there's still consideration of how this will be delivered in some places.
Apologies, I didn't infer that. I think I was just inferring that there will be different models depending on the demographics and how local authorities are taking this forward.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can we move to Mr Gibson to be followed by Jamie Green?
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. Way back in February, the British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists gave evidence to this committee to say that in terms of counsellors, the workforce is there. However, we've already heard from Mr Finlay this morning about long waiting lists for people to actually access these counsellors. So I'm wondering, the £12 million that was allocated in the last financial year, has it been fully utilised? And if not, is it, do you have flexibility within our local authorities to roll that into the current financial year? And does the panel believe that the £16 million for this year and anything left over from last year will be fully utilised?
Ms Cavan.
Thanks, convener. In terms of the waiting list question, the waiting list I think that were referred to related to CAMS waiting times. I don't think they were in relate. Well, they certainly aren't in relation to the school counselling commitment. The thing that I did want to say on the waiting times question is that even when children are waiting to be seen by someone, they are still in school or they are still receiving support in some way. And even when they are being seen, they are still in school, still receiving support in some way. So it isn't the case that someone would be necessarily waiting without any support. But just to clarify that the waiting times that were referred to were around counselling. In terms of the funding was able to be carried forward by local authorities. That will be down to local processes and local decisions on that front. So I couldn't comment on individual local authorities' processes that way.
Okay. Now, Children First have said that some 57% of parents that they surveyed have concerns about the mental health of their children. I'm just wondering whether the panel feels, therefore, that the resource, both in people and finance, will be sufficient to deal with that. And I take on board what Ms Cavan said about waiting lists, but is it not a case that young people who are at school do have to wait often a considerable amount of time to be seen at CAMS at present? And how will that be helped by the new system whereby they'll be seen in schools? Will it reduce waiting times, or will it effectively just mean that there'll be it will be matched by increased demand? What's the feeling that people have?
Perhaps go to Ms King initially for that, and then to Mr Syme.
Thank you for your question. I think, again, it's early days probably as far as having any sort of baseline measures, if you like, with regard to the waiting times. I think it comes back to, again, that when we're working with counselling services and counsellors in schools, they're part of a school system and a wider community system, counselling is aimed to, as Barry has referred to, be implemented, if you like, at Tier 2 within that system, or an earlier level of intervention. So the longer term aim would be that we would hope that that would mean that young people don't necessarily need to have access to CAMS, but that wouldn't be the case for every young person. It depends on those, again, who are eligible for counselling, or who would be a best fit, if you like, for counselling in terms of being able to make use of it. And there will still be some young people who do need to have direct referral to CAMS, albeit through a staged intervention process and in consultation with the staff and the parents who know them well. So, and I suppose the other thing is that we'd have to look, I suppose it's going to be about correlating, if you like. So, it might not only be counselling that is the key factor, if you like, in affecting CAMS waiting lists, because as we've referred to, there are a number of other range of interventions and supports in place for schools, but we would hope it would be a contributing provision, if you like, to working with our colleagues in CAMS to ensure that those young people who are, and families who are then referred to CAMS, have access to it within a reasonable length of time, and that they're the right families who are referred to CAMS, because I think there's further work obviously be done within our mental health and wellbeing frameworks, and certainly the local consultation we've had with CAMS is that we want to make sure that when we are referring, and that includes our GPs, when we are referring families to CAMS, that we've made the right judgments about that. And I think counselling again will help us with another source, if you like, of assessment information about young people and what interventions are going to be right for them, including their families.
I think Ms King and Ms Syme, Ms Cavan and Mr Syme want to come in on that point as well. Yeah. Mr Gibson's, Mr Syme, then Ms Cavan.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, I'd love to think that, if we had high quality counselling services and lots of it, that you would see a reduction in referrals to CAMS. But I mean, I don't think there's a linear progression between having anxiety and then ultimately ending up at CAMS. a lot of, in my experience, a lot of young people end up at CAMHS who have not been through any support systems at all. For some reason, that you have a sudden crisis or whatever, or they're not known to support services. So I think it's very difficult to see the correlation between having supports in place, such as counselling and seeing a reduction in CAMHS over a short period of time is going to be realistic. I'd like to think about a whole system approach where you've got counselling as one part of that, but also focus on universal awareness raising around mental health and positive mental health, relationship building, and then start to look at tier 1 and tier 2 systems, which are things like supports within schools before they get to counselling. And if they do require one-to-one counselling or evidence-based group work, because a lot of the evidence that we're seeing is that young people actually prefer to work in groups as opposed to be extracted from class, because there can be stigma there. So I think you have to look more broadly, which we're all doing here, about the supports, and counselling is one aspect of that for some young people, and it will prevent some young people getting referrals to CAMHS, but it's actually looking at that whole systems approach. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that. Thanks.
Ms Cavan.
Thanks, convener. It really builds on the points that have been made there. We need to be quite clear that this is separate from child and adolescent mental health service. It's separate from CAMHS. This is not part of the whole system, yes, but we are not looking at counselling as clinical support that CAMHS might provide. Counselling could be provided for a range of reasons. We aren't looking at this as something that someone would require a diagnosis for to access. So it needs to be seen as quite separate from CAMHS, and kind of from the relationship between waiting times and counselling needs to be. We don't know really what's going to happen there, because there are so many other factors at play as well. So we need to make sure that we're seeing this as quite separate, as part of the whole system, but quite separate from the interventions that would be offered by CAMHS.
Thanks. Now, Mr. Syme, you spoke earlier on about the increase in remote working, obviously because of the impact of the pandemic, and that was also touched on by Beatrice Wishart in her questioning. Now, we've been given a list of the funding allocations to each local authority, but that was obviously done prior to the pandemic. Has there been an increase in costs to delivery of counselling services because of COVID? And if so, do you think that the allocation of funding should be revisited?
Okay, I'll go to Mr. Syme first.
I'm sorry, I don't have any information around that nationally. I couldn't comment on it, unfortunately.
Okay, I'm looking to Ms King or Ms Cavan to see if they want to come in on that point. Ms Cavan wants to come in. Thank you.
Considers that in areas where which are not remote, cities, for example, one would have thought that the cost of delivery of this service would be less expensive if it's face-to-face than by remote working, simply because you don't have to supply all sorts of equipment, etc., that goes along with it. And I would have thought also that the time taken to do counselling would be increased because of all the palaver with, as we all know as MSPs and yourselves as witnesses, of getting connected into systems, etc., etc. So I just wondered, therefore, if the balance between funding and the amount of funding should alter. I mean, for example, we know that the 16 million for this year that was allocated, 1.44 million is allocated just for the 32 service managers, £45,000 each. The remaining 91%, I would imagine, would really be for salaries, training, etc. But clearly, if there's a remote application which wasn't envisaged for, say, Edinburgh or Glasgow, although it might have been obviously for Orkney or Shetland or Western Isles, then that would mean that it has to be revisited. Otherwise, the capacity for counselling surely would have to be reduced if the funding remained as is.
Cavan?
Thanks, convener. We actually lost you a little bit there, but I think I can still partly answer that question. There was a weighting, as I said earlier, given to the distribution of funding in relation to rurality already, so that has been a consideration. In terms of changes to costs as a result of COVID. That isn't something that we have looked at specifically in relation to the counselling commitment, but there was a commitment to revisit the distribution of the funding at a later point in time. It's certainly something that I can come back to you on, but in terms of cost for technology and things like that, that isn't something that I would have in my head at this point in time. It's something that I'm certainly willing to look into and come back to you on, if that's helpful.
Just one final question then, Convener. We've, as I mentioned earlier, been given a list of the allocations for each year for every local authority. Is there flexibility in the system to change that if, for example, in one local authority the demand for the service greatly exceeds that was anticipated, or in another area it's much less than was anticipated, because the sums we have are allocated right across to 2022-23, so that's 4 full years, and it looks to me almost the way they're laid down as if that's your allocation. So I'm just wondering what flexibility is there in the system, or if there isn't any, what should be in the system in order to cope with the potential changes.
I'm going to go to Ms Cavan first for that one.
We have an established process between COSLA and Scottish Government in terms of the distribution of funding. So that would be via the Settlement and Distribution Group, which is a joint local government, Scottish Government group, who would consider the policy intent and the quantum and how best to meet that policy intent through that funding. So there is a process there for those considerations, and that there isn't that we wouldn't be looking at a system whereby if one local authority saw lower demand, that they would not receive the share of their funding, if that makes sense. The other thing to note is that you have in front of you, as you said, the allocation of funding for this particular commitment, but local authorities are also doing a lot outside of that in terms of supporting children and young people's mental health, and indeed they were using attainment challenge funding and other sources of funding to enhance the supports that were available. So this is one part of a wider system of supports that children and young people can access. So the figures in front of you are not the full picture of what is being spent to support children and young people's mental health.
Okay, Dan, if the other panel members want to come in on that point. I'm looking to the panel. Sorry, I will come to you, and Mr. Geary, and then yourself, Mr. Neil. I don't think they do. Mr. Gibson, is that you?
Very much.
You can do. Thank you. If I could ask a supplementary, and I don't know if this is one that you'll have to come back to us on, but it's mainly for Ms. Cavan. I'm a little bit confused now. Mr. Gibson has been talking about the figures for this particular policy, but there has been discussion about staff training and support staff who are able to provide and support this service. So we know it's about BCAP counsellors, and we know that's a very expensive training course to go through, £7,000 to be BCAP counsellor, £2,000 for someone to retrain. Is there any funding available to people who want to do that process? And in terms of what you talked about with the SQA and different qualifications coming through, and the discussions with the universities, are you saying that there's other qualifications that would meet the needs of this policy that will be available for people to retrain? Or is this simply about BCAP counsellors? I'm going to go to Ms. Cavan for that.
When I referred earlier to the qualifications, that was something that Scottish Government colleagues were looking into, and I actually don't have the detail of that to hand just now, but I can certainly find out for you and provide that in correspondence if that would be helpful. I think what I wanted to emphasise was that although there is this commitment with this defined pot of money around it, on the ground that it is part of a wider system of supports that are available, so we can't see it in isolation.
Okay, thank you. Can I move to Mr. Green and then to Mr. Neil?
Convener, most of my questions have already been asked, including in supplementaries. And I think my questions are probably best directed at the Cabinet Secretary or the Government Ministers. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr Green. Mr Neil?
Thank you, Convener. Can I, first of all, ask the three of you, has there been an overall profiling of demand for these services? For example, we know demand is very high and it's got worse during the COVID period, but are there certain pinch points, for example, particular ages? I don't mean age groups, 13 to 16 or 18, but actually ages like 13, 16, people transitioning from primary to secondary. Are there particular ages at which demand for services are much higher than they are elsewhere? Is demand for services, as one would expect, much higher in areas of poverty and deprivation? Are there certain geographies? I mean, we've heard this morning a reference to a particular problem in the Highlands amongst adults in the Shinty community. And I don't think we understand the reasons for that at the moment. But are there particular geographies, other than just poverty and deprivation, where there are pressure points? So is there a profile for demand? And if we look, is there anywhere we can look at the trends and how the pattern of demand for services is changing over time?
Okay, and I go to Mr Syme for that first, please.
It very much depends on whether a contract was already in place. So in Glasgow, where there's been school counselling services for a number of years provided by Health Improvement and Third Sector, we've got significant data as part of the contract. And I think it's really important that when we've been looking at the procurement contract, that we're specifying the reporting on this to actually identify who's actually coming through at what stage. I need to go back also to the age and stage of the young person, because a 10-year-old developmentally and the ability to actually talk about their emotional issues is very different from a 16-year-old. So we have to think more broadly about what type of counselling support, because and also a number of providers focus specifically on secondary schools and adults, whereas there are a few providers, Place to Be, for example, tend to focus on primary, and they would be arguing, and they put it in their submission, that some of the group work and some of the individual therapy and working with families is more effective. So I think we have to build up a picture, not only by local authority, but it'd be ideal across Scotland if we could actually identify what necessarily is working, because I think quality assurance around counselling and mental health interventions is really important, because it's not just saying the young person's been referred and been seen, it's what was that outcome. So what is the pre-test and what is the post-test, and what is the long-term outcome of that? I think that's a piece of work that, there's an opportunity here across Scotland possibly about how we'd actually do that and actually figure out what actually works. And is that on a demographic basis? Is it to do with deprivation? Is it to do with rurality? So a lot of questions there that I can't answer, but I really think there are possibilities here if we actually do it properly. Yeah. Thank you, Fiona.
Ms Cavan, you want to come in?
Yeah, and it was more on a wider point around engagement with children and young people. The committee will be aware that the Youth Commission on Mental Health published a report last year, which was really looking at what young people themselves were saying they required by way of support, or they wished by way of support. And one of the key things was that they wanted to be involved in developing those supports, but they wanted to have someone that they knew would be there and that they knew they could trust. So that's an important thing to remember. The other thing is that the Children and Young People's Mental Health and Wellbeing Programme Board have a participation officer associated with them, and their role is to ensure that the voices of children and young people feed directly into that programme board and inform the range of supports and the range of interventions that are available. They also have an advisory board which is co-chaired by a young person alongside a youth organisation chair. And they also have a lived experience panel in development as well. So we really are trying to make sure that the voices of children and young people are central to the supports that are developed.
Thank you. Ms King, I don't know if you want to come in on that point. Yeah, please.
I think I would probably to add what has been said, and certainly Barry's point about having outcome measures which over time will give us the kind of data in terms of what the profile, if you like, looks like within an authority and across Scotland, that we would hope that the Health and Wellbeing Census, when it's underway, would provide us with some useful data, along with obviously what providers themselves are going to be reporting on at a local level. So we could have a very rich picture actually in future, and we would be expecting the Health and Wellbeing Census to be underway. It was obviously again put on hold in terms of COVID, but there were a number of Pathfinder or early adopter authorities ready to implement it this year.
Those responses were very helpful indeed, because I think basically the fundamental points being made are, number one, at the moment we don't have across the country a national picture on an up-to-date basis of the problem and the analysis of where the worst problems exist, and we don't know how effective what we're doing is in meeting the problem. The other point I would make, Convener, is if we're going to have a preventive strategy, as you always should do in relation to health, is to see where we can prevent the problem arising in the first place, then in order for a preventive strategy to be effective, we need the kind of data on a comprehensive, updated, regular basis that the three respondents were identifying. So that's extremely helpful, I think, and some follow-up potential there for the committee. The next point I want to make is, and Kenny Gibson touched on it, what is the relationship between what we know about where the problem is most acute and the allocation of resources? Now, there are other issues that do come in. For example, the cost of delivering services in rural areas is much higher usually than it is in urban areas. But in terms of the money that's been allocated that we're talking about this morning, is that related to a standard formula of how money is distributed between local authorities? Or was there any attempt to try to direct the resources primarily to those areas that had the greatest challenge?
Ms Cavan.
Thanks, Convener. I think I answered earlier that there is a process between Scottish Government and local government whereby the Settlement and Distribution Group meet and consider the policy intent alongside the funding available and the factors that might impact on delivery of that policy. So, for example, they considered the rural element to that, and they consider a range of other factors as well. So it isn't that there is one method that funding is distributed for all policies. They do carefully consider the intent and the best way to meet that intent through the distribution.
And my final question, again building on what Kenny Gibson asked, clearly this is just part of the overall funding for mental health and associated services for our young people. But is there readily available anywhere the big picture in terms of funding, so that when you take all the strands of funding locally and nationally together and other sources that are non-governmental, is there a big picture in each local authority and across Scotland as to how much money is being directed where and for what purpose, and on the timescale of that investment?
Okay, Ms Cavan, I think that's one for you again.
Thanks, Convener. I think that the short answer to your question is no, because that's a really difficult question to answer when you're thinking about the range of factors that can prevent someone from experiencing distress or mental illness. I mean, you could take it to the extremes of, what other, like what youth services are available, or what green space is available and things like that. There are such a range of factors that can impact on someone's mental health and well-being that we need to consider you know, the overall picture in relation to prevention and early support, you would be able to, you know, look at figures for what was spent on, and I think Audit Scotland did last year or the year before, look at what was spent on, for example, CAM services, psychological therapies, and have a look at what attainment funding and things like that was spent on mental health and wellbeing. So there are bits of a picture, but in terms of getting, you know, what is spent overall on supporting someone's mental health and wellbeing, you know, that's a really, really difficult question to answer, and as well as so individual, and individual factors come into it that unless you were very clearly defining what you were looking to measure in terms of funding, then you might struggle a wee bit there, but there's probably more that could be done to look at that.
Not cart and horse, we should actually be very clear in what we're trying to achieve. And if we specify what we're trying to achieve, then we can relate surely this funding specifically allocated for that purpose. And if we could then see the money that's going in and the outcomes that are coming out, we can establish where we're getting value for money and where we need to do things better and differently. Yeah.
Ms. Cavan?
Yeah, certainly I would agree. In terms of if you were looking to measure the funding spent on a specific purpose, you would be able to, or you might have a better idea of the kind of areas that you were looking to measure.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Greer and then to Ms. Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to pick up on a couple of issues that have come out throughout the morning. And the first one, it may be that Barry's the best place to answer it in the first instance, but others might have thoughts as well around workforce, some of the issues that were brought up early in this session. I'm wondering if the restoration of the bursary for educational psychology has had, and if you expect it will have the desired effect in making sure that we actually have a sustainable pipeline of people coming into the profession to fill the counselling posts that are being created.
Mr. Syme?
I think that there are two separate things there. I mean, education psychologists are not counsellors, and they're quite different, as you're aware. But I do think we're really about to see a significant improvement in the education psychology workforce due to the reinstatement of the bursary or the partnership funding. So we currently have 29 what are called Year 3 psychologists out in placement now for this year doing the Stage 2 qualification. There's a further 60 13 Year 1 and 13 Year 2 about to start. So within the next 3 years, you're going to have an additional 89 psychologists, which is a quarter of all education psychologists across the country, compared to where we were in 2009. So that's a huge improvement. I can only see that benefiting mental health services, because when we looked at it, as PEP looked in 2015, I think it was, looking at a week's work analysis, 33% of our work at that point was related to mental health, either interventions or training. I would say it's much higher now. I couldn't guess, but I would say probably getting beyond 50%. So that will complement this. But I also think where educational psychologists will really be able to help in relation to counselling is that advising schools on what the best options for counselling are. Because if you're looking at a broad range of offers from either person-centred counselling or adolescents, compared to things like possibly play therapy or drama therapy type approaches or group work counselling at primary, then I think education psychologists are really well placed to help the schools identify where the best intervention is, and whether that is under the counselling offer or it's in some other form of intervention, which may well be related to a referral to mental health services or to some other third sector organisation. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I have to admit that the reinstatement of the partnership funding has had a huge improvement, and the quality of the third year trainees is superb, you know, coming off the course, off the master's course. So I think there's some real positives there. Thank you very much.
Mr. Greer?
Excellent, thank you. Other panellists may want to to reflect on that as well, but I've got quite a few other questions I think I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on. And in this instance, it's bring up a point that Barry had mentioned earlier on. I think, Jennifer, hopefully you might be able to comment on this in particular. But Barry mentioned the need for kind of more emotional literacy, if supporting young people depending on the age and stage that they're at. Having young people that are able to talk about what they're going through is critical. This committee a couple of years ago did an inquiry into personal and social education, health and wellbeing in our schools. Off the back of our inquiry, there was a review by Education Scotland, and the government accepted all of the recommendations in that review. Part of our inquiry and what came out in the review was around the need for far more consistency in education around mental health, so that young people have that vocabulary to talk about their own mental health, have a basic level of awareness around good and bad mental health, where issues may or may not be occurring, and where to go for support. That was a couple of years ago now. I think it was 2 years ago that the recommendations were all accepted. So I'd be interested in hearing from yourselves if you believe that improvements are now either being made or the plans are in place to get those improvements there, so that we've got that consistent mental health education that it gives young people the confidence and even just that basic vocabulary to talk about what might be going on for them, so they know to go and get support because they've been educated on this.
Ms. King.
Okay, thank you for your question. Yes, I mean, I think the PSHE and the delivery of that, through our schools in a number of different ways is critical to the theme that probably has come through a lot of our responses about actually we're supporting a much wider system here, if you like, and that the efficacy, if you like, and the effectiveness of counselling will be in part dependent on how good the other parts of the system are. And that would certainly be the case for PSHE, and as well as approaches such as, I mean, we've referred to, I think, briefly, implementing whole school nurture approaches, which also has a key principle in terms of giving children the language and the vocabulary to be able to communicate their needs, or indeed for an adult to be well attuned enough to be able to understand what it is they're communicating. And I think that there's a range of age and stage approaches in our schools now, and there's certainly been a refocusing of that, if you like, as schools have returned full-time since August, including some national awards, for example. One of my schools referred to, the National 5 in health and wellbeing, and how a number of pupils had really engaged with that in terms of their understanding, if you like, both for themselves and for their peers. So, and I suppose that quality assurance around it, if you like, in terms of our quality assurance framework, such as Higgius 4, is another place in which we would be looking at the extent to which schools are self-evaluating and improving in that area. So I think it's, yes, I mean, I think that there's a refocusing, if you like, on that in light of what has happened, but it's a critical part of the system that we've been speaking about.
I don't know if Mr. Syme or Ms. Cavan want to come in on those points. Yeah, Ms. Cavan.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, Mr. Greer. The one other thing that I wanted to flag there was that in the alongside the programme for government commitment that Scottish Government made around counselling was that they would increase and improve training resources and offers for school staff, as well as the access to counsellors. So there's that piece of work ongoing as well. There is a national group made up of a range of partners working in schools, looking at the resources that are available for staff and for pupils, for learners, to develop their knowledge around mental health as well. So that work is ongoing at a national level, and there's a great deal of work ongoing locally. Some of the resources that we have seen, and some of the best ones, are the ones developed by children and young people themselves from their own experiences. So learning and sharing those among schools and among local authorities is a key priority for that group.
Okay, Mr.
That's
Greer.
great, thanks. Could I just ask on that? Just on that point around training, the additional training that came out of the previous work and the work that's ongoing around developing that, is that additional training, or at least some of it, is that becoming available now? I'm aware that obviously that we've experienced significant disruption in what would have been a period of preparing a lot of this, but I'm also aware that it's been quite some time since the last round of funding for mental health first aid training was made available for school staff. So I'd be really interested to hear if what's coming through this particular pipeline, if any of that is available now, and if not, what the timescale is for you expect that training to become available for teachers and other staff.
Ms. Cavan, yeah.
I believe that the mental health first aid training is still available for those working in local authorities, but I am also aware that Public Health Scotland and NHS Education for Scotland, as I said earlier, are developing a range of resources and training offers for those working with children and young people. It's also something that the Children and Young People's Mental Health and Wellbeing Programme Board are looking at. There's a specific work stream looking at workforce training. So although I don't have perhaps the timescales that Mr. Gray is looking for, I can perhaps follow up with some information on that.
That would be great, thank you. I've got one final question if there's time, convener,
yes,
but I'm aware there may or may not.
No, you're fine.
Thanks. Yeah, just one open question to all the panellists. We could be facing a situation, hopefully not, but we could be facing a situation of further lockdowns across the country. And this was touched on right at the start of how councillors and other staff who are already in place were able to support young people during the previous national lockdown. Do you feel that adequate resources are in place in the event of any further localised lockdown or, God forbid, another national lockdown, for councillors to be able to support young people when no one is actually in the school setting, for that remote support to be available?
Okay, I'll go to Mr. Syme first.
I don't know if there is evidence, but I believe, yes, we're in a much better place. I think lockdown happened very, very quickly. The fact that hardly anybody, certainly in my profession, was actually using video conferencing, yet now it's a daily occurrence of how we use that. I think we're clearer about security around video conferencing and the various applications. I think also schools are in a better place now than they were because it happened very, very quickly and they had to respond to contact vulnerable families. And they did so throughout the actual closed down period, certainly within my local authority. But I think if it was going to happen again, I think they've learned from those lessons over the past few months and are actually in a better place to do that. So I would probably say, yes, we are in a better place than we were. Is it perfect? No, because I don't think anything is better than face-to-face. It's really difficult. Having done it, it's a hard task because it's difficult to read the body language of young people, particularly if the internet connection is pretty poor. And likewise, it's the confidentiality aspect. If there's a young person's talking about personal issues and the family are around, even if it's a very supportive family, they're still quite often unwilling to actually share those, which is why I think a lot of young people who were involved in counselling didn't take up virtual counselling because they had those concerns. So maybe that's something we have to do as part of future planning, is to say that if for whatever reason we cannot meet face to face, how do we do that? How would you want it done? And another thing is, at what time of the day do you want it done? Because a lot of young people are probably more functional later in the day or maybe the evenings. How does that work with counselling? So I think we have to think about the practicalities of it. But I hope that answers your question, Mr. Greer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Ms. King.
Yeah, I would agree with what Barry had to say. I think that we certainly have learned actually that how adaptable the services can be, and our staff in schools demonstrated that, along with those who were providing counselling. And I think that those of us who are going through a procurement process at the moment, that's certainly something that we have asked providers to be able to demonstrate to us, is how adaptable and flexible can they be in relation to perhaps a more virtual or not having face-to-face if that's not going to be feasible, but being able to return to that, which many of them are beginning to do now. And I think things like platforms such as Attend Anywhere have been helpful in allowing that. And I think the only thing probably I would add that in looking at, albeit, perhaps smaller numbers, but just ensuring things like accessibility. So, for example, British Sign Language users, small numbers perhaps across Scotland, but nevertheless, from an equalities issue, we need to ensure that that platforms are there that enable them to have accessibility. But yeah, I think we're arguably in a better place than we were before, but let's hope we don't have to go back there too much.
Okay, Ms. Cavan.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just come back to something that I said earlier, and it picks up on Mr. Syme's point around if people are in their own home and they have other family members around and they perhaps don't want to speak on phone or via a digital platform where they are using video conferencing. Some local authorities have referred to the fact that they have used messaging services or similar to WhatsApp or something like that, so that young people can message back and forward. And certainly some of the feedback from children and young people is that's how they communicate with their friends. So it's a more kind of second nature kind of way of communicating than face to face. So that's actually something that they have preferred, even like they would prefer to do that rather than being in a room with someone. And I think that comes back to something that we need to keep in mind throughout any of these supports that are delivered or developed, is that every young person is different and has a different style or a different communication style or a different way that they would like to be supported, and we need to make sure that we are rooting this in GIRFIC and making sure that it is what that child or young person and their family are looking for by way of support, and that it is right for them.
Mr. Gray.
That's all from me. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you very much. And go to Ms. Mackay. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Can I ask Jennifer King, please, will there be an impact assessment on COVID done for children with additional support needs?
Ms. King?
Is this with reference to counselling then? Can I just clarify that? Or are you speaking more generally?
Just generally, I mean, are there plans to do that? Because in an earlier session, I think I'm right in saying that Councillor McCabe said that there would be, but I'm just wondering if you know if that's part of your remit.
I'm not sure that I can fully answer that question. I'm not aware of. It might be one that's better for Laura to answer from the perspective of anything that Councillor McCabe had agreed to.
I'll go to Ms. Cavan, but I'm perfectly happy to say that you'll take that on board and come back to us if you don't have the answer just now.
I'll pick up on that very briefly. There is so there's a COVID-19 Children and Families Leadership Group, which is jointly chaired by Scottish Government and Solace, and they are doing leading a lessons learned from COVID-19 exercise in the kind of wider how has that impacted on children and young people context. So not specific to additional support for learning, but certainly specific to children and young people and the support that they might need going forward.
Back to us with the point about children with additional needs. That would be great if you know of anything that's happening there. Can I ask a further question, please? And it's probably Mr. Syme that might be able to answer it. I just wanted to ask you about the actual practicalities of counselling in schools. I mean, do children come to you? Do they know how to access a counsellor? Are they referred by their parents? Are they referred by a teacher? If you could maybe just give us a picture of how that works.
Mr. Syme?
Thank you, Ms. Mackay. It very much depends on the contract that would be in place. So my experience of working within a contract framework is that, and particularly in a secondary school, the referral would be either made by the young person directly or via their pastoral care teacher or their year head. So normally the pastoral care teacher or their year head would be aware of some issues because they would have spoken about it beforehand. And that kind of goes back to staged intervention. So it'd be having that initial discussion, or the parents may well contact the school and say, my young person's having issues, whatever. and then the referral would be made to the counsellor in school, and it would be agreed at what point the young person would be either extracted from class or at some other point of the day. Some would offer it during lunch times, just depends on it. So it's very much based on the geography of the school, the layout of the school, but also the timetable and when the young person, because what you don't want is a young person to be continually removed from the same subject because they're going to miss so much work. There's also issues around the stigma of having to leave the class, because most young people will tell you they're going someplace else. So I think what we've learned from previous contracts is that there has to be more flexibility, and part of the contract, part of the Scottish Government guidance, is that it has to be effectively 52 weeks. Well, take away Christmas, but it should be out with school terms as well. So there would have to be counselling within the schools or within some community venue. But given that most secondary schools are open throughout the year, then that should not be a problem. There's also restrictions about how information is kept and how it's recorded, and also the feedback. So we'd always be looking for a feedback loop in that the young person is referred to the counsellor would agree with the young person the number of sessions they're going to work on, and then probably some peer post test. So that could just be a wellbeing assessment, or it could be using young people's core assessment, which is a clinical assessment before and after, that you'd measure change. And then there needs to be some method of recording that within the child's plan. So, for example, into the pastoral notes to say the young person has attended counselling, because it may well be that they attend counselling for, let's say, 6 or 12 sessions within their second year, and may well revisit that a couple of years later, depending on it, because bearing in mind that mental health is not a static thing, it changes over time. So it's trying to be as flexible as possible, and I think that's one of the reasons why the procurement has taken so long for some local authorities, because trying to get this into a framework that meets the needs of all your young people, and that's not just for secondary age children. When you start going down into primary, it's even more complex, because the counsellor would probably maybe be on the school once every few weeks, whereas with secondary, based on allocation, I mean, some of the secondary schools in Glasgow will have a full-time counsellor effectively based on their allocation. So does that answer your question?
Well, it does, yeah. Just a couple wee more detail, if you don't mind. Just so if the young person wanted to ask you directly, do they just email, do they just email a counsellor? And if that happens and they said, well, I don't really want my parents to know, I mean, is the school duty bound to tell parents, or how does that work?
Again, it depends on the age group. What has tended to work in the past in primary schools, and depending on the provider, the young person might well post a note through a box to say, I'm not feeling very happy about things, can I speak to the counsellor? Again, it depends on the relationship. So if you've got a counsellor who's in the school 2 days a week, for example, based on the contract, then they'll be part of almost the furniture effectively, because they're in the school. In terms of secondary, would be if the young person wants to speak to the counsellor and they feel that the parents shouldn't be informed, then that would be acceptable, as long as we adhere to child welfare and protection guidelines. So if the young person was saying that I'm being abused, or I'm get significant problems, I think the other thing I would have to say is the counsellors have got to be very clear about at what level do they work to. So if the young person is starting to talk about suicidal thoughts or self-harm, then that probably has to come back into a further discussion to say, is this appropriate for counselling? And a lot of really skilled counsellors are very good at that, so they just don't keep on working on the problem when possibly that young person needs a higher level of mental health support, so maybe referral to CAMHS. In an ideal world, you'd also have a joined upness, so that if the young person is going through school counselling and you feel that it needs to be escalated to a higher level, then that should really contribute to a referral to CAMHS, because a lot of the work has already been done in terms of taking the history and working with them. So again, that's written into the contract.
Okay, thanks. And roughly how long do the sessions last with the child or young person?
Again, it'll depend on the type of counselling approach, because there are various different approaches there. So some counsellors will offer 6 sessions, some might offer 12, some might offer 16, some might offer just a couple of sessions. But again, it very much depends on the counselling approach that adopted, because there are various kind of approaches within that. So it's not really definitive. I think the longer term counselling can be problematic because you get drop off. So young people may well have a session, but they don't make it, so they don't attend because at some points they feel better about it, so they don't actually have to complete the counselling. So it's not one size fits all. I think it has to be more flexible.
Thank you. That's helpful. Just final question, Mr. Simon. I don't know if you can answer this. Maybe someone in the panel. Who's actually got the kind of overarching responsibility for coordinating this, so that we do know what's happening Scotland-wide? I mean, it seems like everybody's sort of off doing their own thing. So, is there anybody coordinating it? Is there a body that's responsible to coordinate it?
Mr. Simon, do you want to answer that, or Miss King? Do you want to come in? Miss King?
I think that at the moment, in terms of that oversight, you know, all local authorities obviously have fed back their interim plans, and we expect to feed back further, obviously, you know, directly back to Scottish Government. Beyond that, in terms of the coordination, I couldn't answer any further than that at the moment. The local authorities, I suppose, obviously through both my network and through ASPEP, we are sharing our updates in relation to where we're at. But beyond that, I don't know whether Laura can add anything to that.
Miss Cavan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I can add slightly to that in that, in an informal sense, the information that is shared with Scottish Government will come back to the Children and Young People's Mental Health and Wellbeing Programme Board for them to consider that as they're taking a kind of overall approach and looking at the kind of not just counselling, looking at the community wellbeing supports as well, and looking at the wider school support too. So they will be considering that as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that concludes questions from our committee this morning. So can I thank you all for your attendance. It's been a very interesting panel this morning. We have a final agenda item that will be taken in private. So can I remind members to log on to Teams at 11:55 and we'll suspend for just 10 minutes to allow people to do that. Thank you very much.